Thanks, Mercy, for that introduction, and to you and the other organizers for inviting me here today. Great to be here on a nice sunny Friday afternoon. So for talk, I'm just going to start with a little background about the Nature Conservancy of Canada, just to provide a little bit of information on our organization and what we do and kind of where we work, for those who may not have heard of us before. And then I'm gonna switch into talking about some of the bat research that has recently been conducted on some of the lands that we manage and how we are hoping to incorporate that into some of the management that we do as an organization. So the Nature Conservancy of Canada, or NCC, has been around since 1962. Just last year, we celebrated our 6th anniversary of working in Canada. And NCC is an environmental nonprofit organization, and we're actually the leading national land conservation organization in the country. And our purpose is really nature, we build a thriving world. So we really believe that the interconnection between nature and people is sort of the foundation of the work that we do. And that when nature and the environment thrive, then we can as well. So as a national organization, we do work throughout all of the provinces, as well as we partner with various agencies to support conservation work in the Northern Territories. And we tend to focus our conservation work in the area of the country where habitats and species face the greatest threats. Well, of course, in Canada, that tends to be more southern part of the country, where settlement has been concentrated and where there's more, tends to be more development and land conversion and resource extraction and that kind of thing. Today, as of today, Nature Conservancy of Canada and our partner are working to conserve 14 million hectares across the country. On a more local scale, in Saskatchewan, we also tend to focus our work in the southern part of the province. The very first project that we had in Saskatchewan was 1982, and that was a project in the Qu'Appelle River Valley. And to date, we are helping conserve more than 198,000 hectares of significant, ecologically significant land and waters in Saskatchewan. So what does NCC do? So in terms of what we do, really at the heart of our work is to conserve land for biodiversity. And this involves various different aspects. But one of the big components of our work is land procurement. And this can happen in a couple of different ways. The first being fee simple land securement. So this occurs when lands are either donated to NCC or we purchase land and we become the title holder of those lands. And then we can manage those lands in a way to maintain or increase biodiversity and for those conservation values. So our fee simple sites that we manage are the ones that are open to the public. So foot access only, and we ask that folks leave the gates as you found them. And some of these sites are also open for hunting, but permission is required for that, and it's just sort of a safety thing so we can keep track of who's out there. The other type of securement that we do a lot of is conservation easements. So with this type of securement, land ownership is retained by the landowner, but restrictions are placed on sort of what can and what can't happen on that land. So for example, the native prairie can't be broken or no wetland drainage can occur. And we work with the easement holders to kind of meet their needs in terms of excluding areas from the easements as appropriate. And so easements are placed on the title. So even if that landowner sells the land to someone else, those restrictions still apply. So it's a different way of being able to conserve that land in perpetuity as well. So conservation planning is another big aspect of the work that we do. And our planning tends to happen on two scales. So the first is on landscape scale. So to facilitate our planning at this level, within each province, the areas that are divided into something we call natural areas. And these tend to be areas of very high ecological value, maybe areas really a lot of threats happening to biodiversity. And so they're a way to kind of focus our efforts on a specific area and then develop conservation targets for within those areas. So at this level, we developed some of the natural area conservation plan. And these are focused on developing strategies and activities to achieve conservation goals for these areas. And they tend to be pretty long-term plans, usually about 10 years. And a lot of the activities are based on partnerships. So they apply not only to the lands that we directly manage, but also involve our work with other agencies, landowners and others to kind of, in areas we can also influence sort of what's happening on the ground. So we do rely heavily on partnerships for conservation efforts at this scale. And then the second area or the second scale of planning that we do is more tailored to a specific site or property. And these are pretty unique. There's no like one size fits all property management. So they are site specific. They tend to be a little bit shorter in duration. They're about 5-year plans, so renewed every 5 years. And so when NC takes over the management of a specific site, we'll do something called a baseline inventory, which is essentially kind of what it sounds like. We do surveys and kind of collect as much data as we can on a specific site. So figuring out what species are found there, what habitats are there, is there any issues with invasive species, any species at risk that we might want to consider. And then we take all that information and we develop a plan for how we will manage that site. And that can include aspects like how we're going to do monitoring, if we're going to do health assessment, if that land is going to be grazed and what kind of grazing it's going to have. That's kind of how we develop our planning on a more local scale. So land management is another major aspect of the work we do. And this is basically using various tools to maintain or improve the ecosystem health and biodiversity of areas that we have title to. For example, some of this management can include things like prescribed fire, which involves using fire as a tool to keep grasslands healthy. Another big aspect of land management is grazing. So having animals grazing the grass is a really important component to maintaining the health of those grasslands. And obviously we do recognize that the prairies are a working landscape. And so having grazers and having people who manage cattle on the land and having access to the land is really important as well. Invasive species control is another big one, as well as restoration. And we're actually currently developing a restoration framework for the prairie provinces, which is going to guide our restoration efforts over the next decade or so here. So we're really about to ramp up our efforts in terms of restoration. So this could include things like planting trees or more northern trees. It could also include seeding cultivated land back to native species, or even also include some kind of invasive species as well. So another major part of what we do is engaging the public through outreach and education. This can include things like webinars. It can include having guided nature hikes at some of the sites we manage, or on the land activities. And one of the big sort of group of activities is we call conservation volunteer events. So these are events where we bring volunteers out to the sites that we manage, and we actually have them participate in stewardship activities. So could be things like capping fence posts, or removing invasive species, just doing general cleanup kind of thing. And this is a really important component of our work. We are sort of a smaller organization, and we are limited in terms of what we're able to do. So having these types of events where we are able to bring lots of people out is really important and helps us get those stewardship activities done. Then I also just wanted to mention a really important component of our work, and that's being guided by our Indigenous Conservation Engagement Framework. So as an organization who owns and manages land, we are aware, we recognize that, you know, conservation has not always been supportive of Indigenous people and communities that have been here for millennia, taking care of the land. And we recognize that in many cases, conservation efforts have actually excluded people from the land. This framework is really helping to guide our work at a national and local scales to see what we can do in terms of being able to provide and facilitate safe access for Indigenous people to cultural resources lands that we manage. And then finally, science is also a big part of the work that we do. So we are an evidence-based organization. When we're doing our plan, we do our best to incorporate the best available information. We have something called the Weston Family Science Program, supporting research throughout the country. And we also rely heavily on local research partnerships with local researchers or agencies or individuals who are interested in partnering with us. Usually that's in terms of being able to come onto the lands that we manage to do research, and that is beneficial for them, so can help inform the work that we do as well. All right, so hopefully that gave you a little bit of background about NCC and the work that we do. So I'm going to switch gears here now and talk about some of the research that we've recently been a part of in Saskatchewan around bats, and trying to get a better understanding of which species are using the lands that we manage in areas of the province, well, as a more in-depth look about how some of those species are using the lands that we manage, particularly in the boreal transition ecoregion. So this type of research is a little bit beyond our capacity as an organization. So we actually hired a contractor, a consultant to this work, and that was Joe Poisson from Redgate Consulting. So Joe has a lot of experience in bat ecology and behavior research. And he was really kind of the brains behind designing the study and doing the field work, and then providing us with the data and the analysis. So we really appreciate all his hard work and the expertise that he shared with us as part of this research project. And I will just preface this with the fact that I am not by any means a biologist. This is totally a new area for me as well. So if you have any burning questions about bats, I may not be able to answer them here. Happy to follow with you after. So why are we interested in learning about bats? So obviously our main goal is to conserve habitat for the preservation of diversity, and the bat community is a part of that as well. And really, up until we started this project, we really didn't have a good idea of the bat community and the species that were using the sites that we manage. So if we don't know who's out there and who are using those sites, we can't really develop any management activities to help support those species. So we started incorporating some bat surveys as part of our baseline inventories. And then we also recognize that this type of research can contribute to a broader understanding. This is particularly important for right now. I'm sure you've heard about white nose syndrome, which is a pathogen that's spreading and infecting bat populations throughout North America. It's spreading west, where it really decimated some populations in Eastern America. And it has been detected in Saskatchewan, and I just read an article that it's now been found in Alberta as well. So having a better understanding about the behavior and the ecology and sort of the distribution of these bats in Saskatchewan, hopefully that can help inform management as we try and conserve these species who are facing this this disease. Okay, so that's a little bit about why we're interested in learning about bats. So who interested in bats is found in Saskatchewan. We have 9 different species, and they are all insectivorous, so they all eat insects. And we can kind of group them by their roosting behavior. So a roost site is where bats go to rest for the day. And they also leave their young there when they go foraging. And there are 4 different roosting strategies that we can kind of categorize the bats that occur in Saskatchewan under. So the first one is the cavity roosting bats. So like the name, these bats roost in tree cavities. They can't excavate their own cavities, so they rely on things like woodpeckers to create these cavities, or they use sort of naturally existing cavities found in trees. And they also sometimes will roost in buildings as well. And these are typically colonial, so they roost in groups, usually with related females and their young. So in Saskatchewan, we have 4 species can be classified as cavity roosters: the silver-haired bat, big brown bat, the little brown bat, and the northern long-eared bat. And except for the northern long-eared bat, these are also the bats that you'll find using bats. So the second group is the foliage rooster. And so these will actually roost not in a cavity, but just hanging from the branch of a tree. Tend to be solitary bats, so they don't roost together in groups, and they are long distance migrants. So in Saskatchewan, we have 2 species: the horned bat, which generally prefers to nest or to roost in coniferous trees, and then the eastern red bat, which really prefers deciduous. And then the third group is ground roosting bats. And we have one species in Saskatchewan that uses this roosting strategy, and that is the Western small-footed. So these bats will use cracks and crevices in rocks and cliffs as their roosting locations, and they're the only species that won't use trees for roosting. And they do sometimes also use bridges or buildings as well. And these bats have small maternity colonies, and they typically will forage fairly close to where they're roosting. And then the last group, there's two species in the group, and they use a sort of roosting strategies. Sometimes they use tree cavities. Sometimes they'll roost in cracks or crevices in badland areas. Sometimes they'll actually roost under the back of a tree, and they can use buildings as well. So these are the long-eared myotis and the long-legged myotis. So the first component of this bat reef project involved using acoustic sampling to look at which bat species are present in a given area. So to do this acoustic sampling, this is done using a device called an anabat, and that's what's in the picture there. The anabat is inside that, and then the black cylinder sticking out of the front is a microphone. So this essentially records the echolocation calls the bats are producing as they are foraging. So it doesn't attract the bats to the site in any way. It's just a method of passive sampling. And so since 2017, we've been using these recorders to gather data on the bat communities at various lands that we manage. So I'm just going to share some of those results with you today. So typically the anabats are set up near water bodies, and that's because bats tend to be good foraging locations with insects, high amounts of insects, and so the bats tend to kind of gather there for foraging. And so this was typically, we've set up the anabat on the edges of rivers or wetlands or lakes, attached to a tree or to a fence post. And the anabats would be recording from sunset to sunrise. And depending on the site, we would have multiple sampling locations. Each sampling location was recording for a 7-day period. And we were aiming to get 14 days of recording per site. So when the anabat is recording, it produces these spectrograms, which is essentially a visual representation of the bat location call. So once all of the data collected, Joe was able to remove all of the noise, anything that wasn't, and then look at the spectrograms to identify which species is making that call. So in terms of results, I'm going to go through a couple different NCC managed sites where we had these anabats set up and just talk about some of the interesting results that were found. So the first site I'll talk about is called Hole in the Wall. And this is a site in southern Saskatchewan. It's in the Mixed Creek grassland ecoregion north of the Frenchman River Valley. And it's largely composed of sort of rolling native prairie intermixed with wetlands. So kind of classic prairie pothole country. A lot of these wetlands are ephemeral, so they tend to dry by the end of the summer. And then there was also some little bits of trees and shrubs in some of the coulees as well. And then there are outside of the property several nearby farmyards with trees and buildings that could also be used as roosting sites. So in terms of what was found at this location, so on the figure here, this shows the activity index for this. So on the y-axis is the number of bat calls per hour of recording, and then the species listed at the bottom, and then the colors just represent different sampling sites within hole in the wall. So this one was quite interesting. Had quite a high diversity in terms of the number of species using the site. There were 8 different species detected over the 3 weeks of sampling. However, the activity level was pretty low. So in general, it was less than 1 call per hour of recording. So not a lot of activity, but still pretty good diversity. And this is likely because the roosting sites would be limited at hole in the wall, not a lot of trees, some of cavities. So the bats are probably roosting elsewhere, and so maybe also foraging elsewhere. But interesting to see the diversity. Also interesting to see the little brown bat activity. This is a species that is endangered, and their populations in North America have really been hit hard by white nose syndrome. So interesting to see these bats are found there. The next site is called Saskatchewan. So this is located within the Parkland ecoregion, and it's just on the side of Moose Mountain Provincial Park in southeastern Saskatchewan. And this site is 2 quarter sections in size, and it has quite a varied habitat. It's fairly heavily forested, so lots of trees and lots of big wetlands as well, and lots of big aspen trees surrounding these wetlands. So we thought that this would be a fairly good site, lots of trees, cavities for potential roosting sites. So for this site, we had 2 different sampling locations on the site, and this one had a lot or more activity compared to hole in the wall. Activity index was greater. And again, we had 8 species detected there in total, although very, very few calls for western small-footed and long-eared myotis. Lots of silver-haired bats, and also interestingly, a lot of eastern red bats. So as their name suggests, this is more an eastern species, but they have been kind of really moving west, and this is within their range. But interesting to see. This was the first time that we had ever did this species on CC property. So the next site we looked at, Stark Coulee. So this site is located within the Qu'Appelle River Valley, just northwest of Moose Jaw. And you can see the river kind of runs through the property there. And then there would be grassland in the sort of ruts of the valley, as well as grassland along the slopes of the valley. And this was also a really interesting site. So again, good diversity. What was cool about this is there was quite a lot of little brown bat activity, particularly at one of the sound locations, which was at a bridge on the east side of the property. So it is likely that there is a little brown bat colony somewhere nearby, and that these bats are using the area for foraging. And then there was also quite a relatively large amount of long-legged myotis activity as well. So it's possible that there's a colony of this species somewhere nearby as well. And the few sites I'm going to talk about here are Buffalo Pound and May. These are also in the Qu'Appelle Valley system. The Buffalo Pound is sort of the north end of Buffalo Pound. And then May is a little bit west of that. There's not, May property doesn't have water on it, but it's fairly close to Buffalo Pound Lake that we might expect there could be that activity there as well. So in terms of what we saw here, the results were pretty similar between the two in terms of composition. Big brown, little brown bats, silver-haired bats, so of the cavity roosters. But also interestingly, we saw some western footed myotis at Buffalo Pound and at May. And so this is the that roosts on the ground and cracks and crevices and things. So it's likely that the sort of exposed rock that kind of occurs in the coulees throughout the valley there is providing some roosting locations for this species. So that was neat to see. So just a couple of things that we kind of learned from this. I think it's really cool to see just the diversity in species that we're seeing on these sites. Like I said before, we really didn't have a good idea at all of which species were using these lands. So it's really interesting to learn that and see how many different species are foraging there. Also good to know that there's quite a few NCC managed lands that seem to be providing some sort of type of habitat for the endangered little brown bat. And so as we're developing our conservation planning at a local and at a landscape scale, that's something that we can maybe develop some strategies and activities to help support the conservation of that species. And then also, I think important to, it's a good reminder that, you know, the landscape context is really important. So the bats that are using these sites obviously are not seeing the site boundaries that we are. And so we really need to think about how do the lands surrounding sites, how are important for foraging or roosting, and how can we maybe think about in terms of conservation actions for these species. Okay, so the last little bit of research that I'm going to talk about today is some trapping and tracking work that was conducted on two of the more northern NCC managed lands, be at Nebo and Meeting Lake 3, which are both in the boreal transition region. So some preliminary acoustic data that was done in 2017 showed that both little brown bats and the northern long-eared bats were found on these sites. And we were really interested to learn more about what they were actually doing there. Are they using these sites for foraging? Are they actually roosting at these sites? What kind of trees are they using? What kind of cavities are they using? So we wanted to learn more about that. And so Joe was able to kind of develop a study for us where he would capture the bats, attach radio transmitters, and then track the bats to their roosting sites to see where they are actually roosting. So like I said, this study took place on Nebo and Meeting Lake 3. So these are both about 50 minutes west of Prince Albert. And they're both in the boreal transition ecoregion. And so this ecoregion is really the southern edge of the boreal forest. It's kind of a mosaic of forested land and farmland as well, quite a bit of farmland. And in terms of the forest, it's a mixed forest, trembling aspen, balsam poplar, but also might have white spruce and black spruce, tamarack, as well as fir. So the two study sites were both 3/4 section size, and actually both of them have extensive logging in the past prior to NCC's management of these locations. And they both have forest habitat, lots of wetlands, and swampy lowlands. So just a little bit more about the two species that we are interested in. They're fairly similar in terms of size. They're fairly small, 7 to 10 grams in size. And both of them form mature colonies with related females. And colonies tend to be less than 10 individuals in size, but can be as big as several hundred bats in size. So can be quite a few roosting together in these colonies. They are a little bit different in terms of their foraging behaviors. So little bat is a little bit more of a generalist. We'll use lakes, ponds, and above the forest canopy for foraging. Whereas the northern long-eared bat, a little bit more of a specialist, tends to forage mostly inside the forest, but sometimes we'll use lakes and rivers for foraging as well. So those were the two species that we were most interested in. But we were also really just interested in bats in terms of these two properties as well. So if we weren't able to capture these bat species, we were also interested in more about silver-haired bats, big browns, or whole bats as well, if those were some of the species that were able to be captured. So there were two different methods used for capturing bats, mist nets and harp traps. So mist nets are also used for capturing birds, but essentially a large net strung between two posts. Kind of looks like a volley net, sort of, but the mist nets are typically made of nylon or polyester mesh that's very fine. And so when you set the net between the poles, it's very hard to see. And so the bats will fly in a net and then kind of get tangled in and fall into one of the pouches. And then you would come and untangle the bat and remove. The harp traps are similar. They have a frame with strings hanging down from it, and the bats will fly and then hit the string or kind of turn to move and keep going through, but then they'll hit another one and they end up just kind of dropping down into a bag at the bottom. So they're actually tangled in it, they just drop into this bag and aren't able to out. So those are the two types of traps that were used to catch the bats. And the mist nets were used mostly along the edges of bodies of water or fields, whereas the harp trap was used on sort of narrower forest trails. So both of them were opened at sunset and kept open for at least 3 hours, or closed if the temperature dropped below 5 degrees, or it got too windy, or if it started to rain. And in some cases, it was required to put sort of stack two mist nets on top of each other because the bats were evading the one mist net. So in some cases that was required. And then the Anabat was also placed in trapping locations so that we could detect if there were any other species or bats that were there and in those sites, but maybe just not being caught. So the net at least every 10 minutes, and then bats that were caught were removed and placed in cloth bags where they could be transported back to where things were set up to process them. And any bats that received the transmitters were placed on backs of the bats in between their shoulder blades. In terms of tracking, the bats were tracked daily using an antenna and a receiver until the transmitter fell off or the battery failed, which was about 21 days. So for 3 years of trapping, 2018 2021, and then 2022. So we're still waiting on the 22 results. So I'll just show you the 2018 and 2020 results. So in 2018, the trapping period was between July 2nd and July 26th, and it was 410 trap hours. And 1 trap hour is 1 trap opened for 1 hour. So takes into account multiple traps being open at the same time. That year, 13 bats were caught, silver-haired bats and hoary bats. And 3 of the silver-haired bats received transmitters, and these were Nebo. And then in 2021, the capture period was extended a little bit, and from June 23rd to July 1st, and was 673 trap hours long. But interestingly, they actually fewer bats, 5 bats, 4 at Nebo and 1 at Meeting Lake, and then big brown bat at Nebo. And all 6 of those bats were given transmitters as well. So in terms of tracking, in 2018, tracking the bats resulted in finding 2 distinct roosting locations. The first one was on Nebo itself, and it was about 180 meters west of the trapping location. And the second one was really not on Nebo, it was on privately owned land nearby, and this one was about 540 meters from the trapping location. And interestingly, both these were in aspen trees, and Joe was able to do emergence counts as well. So once he tracked the bats to their roosting tree, he was able to sit below the tree and watch as the bats emerged at sunset. So one roosting location had 26 bats that were roosting together, and the other one was at least 33 bats. So fairly good sized roosting colonies there. And in 2021, some really interesting results. So 3 of the hoary bats that were tracked to different roosting sites, all of those were on Nebo, and they were in trees that were from 90 meters away from the trapping site to about 650 meters away. And then there were some really interesting additional roosting sites. So one of the hoary bats from Nebo and the other hoary bat from Meeting Lake, these bats actually found to be roosting quite far from where they were trapped. The one was 4.4 kilometers away, and the other one was 4.9 kilometers away. So just really interesting to think that these bats are roosting so far away from their foraging. And the tracking kind of showed that as soon as it was sunset, the bats would kind of emerge from their roost and kind of beeline it for Nebo and Meeting Lake. So obviously those sites have some really good value foraging, maybe something that's not present or is sort of limited on the landscape. And then the big brown bat was sort of similar. It was actually found roosting in a building about 4.5 kilometers away from Nebo. And again, same kind of thing. At sunset, the bat would emerge and then head over to Nebo for foraging. So interesting to see that they are traveling such far distances, especially because there's not like consistent corridor of habitat between where they were roosting and where they're foraging. So they do have to travel over agricultural land, which is a little bit risky for them. So kind of suggests that there's something at locations that is worth traveling that far. Joe also suggested that perhaps these bats previously had colonies actually on Nebo or Meeting Lake prior to logging happened. when those areas were logged, maybe the colonies moved elsewhere, but they're still returning there for foraging. And then just quickly here, a few details about the roosting themselves. So for the hoary bats, they were all found to be roosting in mature white spruce, all roosting at least 10 meters above the ground. And the trees they chose were generally on the edges of meadow or trails through the forest, and mostly in stands of other mature white spruce. That seemed to be the kind of areas that they were choosing for roosting. So I think some takeaways that we learned from this research, really just the value of these sites as foraging sites as well as roosting sites. And interesting that bats are coming from a long ways away to forage at these sites. So there could be something there that's limited elsewhere on the landscape. And then again, just considering the importance of things in landscape context, there might be some value in thinking about if they're coming to these sites to forage, how we think about, creating or protecting potential corridors of habitat that might make traveling a little bit safer for these species who are using them. So that's all I'm gonna share today. Thanks again to Joe Poisson for all of his hard work and his expertise in conducting this research. Also want to say a big thank you to Sarah Ludlow, former NCC staff. She was essential with logistics for this project, with finding funding, and also helping with the field work for all the years of this project. Funding support was provided by a grant from Hollowhead, as well as some funding from the government of Saskatchewan's Fish and Wildlife Development Fund. And yeah, if you are interested in learning more about CC and the work that we do and how you can be involved, feel free to reach out or and visit our website, natureconservancy.ca. Yeah, so I think that's it. Thank you for having me. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.